The portrait of a perfect family. In the quiet suburban neighborhood on the outskirts of Seattle, Washington, the Scott family seemed like something right out of a postcard. Their home sat on a tree-lined street, complete with a well-manicured lawn and a white picket fence. It was the kind of house that glowed during Christmas with colorful lights outlining the roof. On summer evenings you could hear the faint laughter of children spilling out from the backyard where a tire swing hung from an old oak tree. Everything about the Scott family gave off an air of harmony and textbook perfection, or so it seemed. At the helm was Brad Scott, a highly respected cardiologist in the city. Tall, charismatic, and always impeccably dressed in tailored suits, Brad exuded an aura of professionalism and reliability. Patients adored him, colleagues admired him, and his family, they idolized him. He often spoke at local health seminars, appeared in community fundraisers, and even volunteered at a free medical clinic on weekends. If ever there was a blueprint for a model citizen, Brad certainly ticked all the boxes. Then there was Mary Scott, Brad's devoted wife of nearly 3 decades. Mary was the quintessential suburban mom. Kind, nurturing, and endlessly patient. She managed the home with an efficiency that made it look effortless, juggling grocery shopping, meal prep, school activities, and birthday parties. She spent her mornings tending to their flower garden, and often hosted coffee mornings for the other moms in the area. Mary wasn't just Brad's partner, she was the glue that bound the Scott family together. The light of their life came in the form of their 3 children, Lisa, Alex, and little Emmy. Lisa, the eldest, was in her final year of medical school, following closely in her father's footsteps. She was driven and meticulous with an intensity that reflected her high aspirations. Alex, the middle child, was the artistic soul of the family, endlessly sketching portraits in his notebook or strumming his guitar on the porch. And Emmy, the youngest, was the quintessential baby of the family, full of life, curiosity, and energy. To any outsider, the Scotts were the true American dream personified. They epitomized stability and success. Their home life was filled with the warm scent of freshly baked cookies, Sunday family dinners, and cheerful holiday traditions. Brad seemingly adored his wife, and Mary was the kind of mom who found joy in packing sandwiches with handwritten notes for her children's lunchboxes. School teachers raved about the kids, neighbors considered the Scotts close friends, and even the local mailman seemed to envy their vibrant bond. But, as they say, appearances can be deceiving. Beneath the cheerful facade and idyllic picture of suburban life, subtle cracks had been forming in their seemingly unshakable foundation. Secrets whispered through the pristine halls of their home, faint enough to escape untrained ears but persistent enough for those closest to the family to sense. What lay behind the front door of this picture-perfect family was far more complicated than anyone could have imagined. Such is the illusion of perfection. Even the brightest pictures cast the darkest shadows. Behind the Scotts' countless holiday photos and Brad's trophies on the mantle hid a story that would unravel in ways no one could have foreseen. And, in a matter of months, the family that symbolized everything good and beautiful in their community would find itself at the center of a mystery that no holiday card could cover up. The illusion of a perfect life. From the outside looking in, the Scott family seemed to have it all. Their colonial-style home, nestled in a peaceful suburb just 30 minutes from downtown Seattle, was picture-perfect. The neatly trimmed hedges, newly painted shutters, and the vibrant seasonal wreath that always adorned their front door served as a testament to Mary Scott's immaculate taste and attention to detail. Everything about their life appeared radiant and polished, like the glossy cover of a family magazine. When neighbors strolled past, they often caught glimpses of the Scotts in perfectly normal family moments. Brad mowing the lawn with the precision of a surgeon, Mary setting out freshly baked pies to cool on the windowsill, and the kids playing tag or swinging in the backyard. It was a slice of Americana that seemed too wholesome to be real, and yet, to everyone who knew them, the Scotts were as authentic as it got. Brad, the head of the household, was the embodiment of stability and success. His job didn't just pay the bills, it elevated the family's status. As one of the region's top cardiologists, Brad wasn't just respected, he was admired. His name carried weight, whether it was in the halls of the city hospital or among the elite who attended fundraisers in glittering hotel ballrooms. He was the kind of guy who never missed an opportunity to be the hero, led CPR training at the local YMCA, gave speeches during Heart Health Awareness Month, or organized charity runs to support underfunded health programs. And beyond his career, Brad was known as a doting husband who often spoke fondly of his Mary, and made grand gestures of love, like surprising her with extravagant anniversary dinners at five-star restaurants. Mary Scott, on the other hand, radiated warmth in a quieter way. While Brad thrived under the public eye, Mary ruled over the private sphere, their home. She wasn't just a housewife, she was the heart and soul of the family. The neighbors admired her garden, where roses and hydrangeas bloomed in perfect symmetry. Parents at the school PTA meetings marveled at her organizational prowess and natural charisma. Mary somehow managed to be everywhere, volunteering at bake sales, setting up lemonade stands with Emmy, keeping up with Lisa's med school applications, and making sure Alex had enough art supplies to fuel his imagination. To those who knew her, she was grace under pressure, the epitome of nurturing love and tireless dedication. Then, there were the Scott kids, each an extension of their parents' seemingly perfect genes and values. Lisa, the eldest, was a brilliant overachiever who carried a quiet but intense determination to follow in her father's footsteps. Her professors at medical school described her as one of the brightest young minds they'd encountered in years. Alex, with his floppy hair and a guitar slung casually over his shoulder, was the creative spirit, the kind of kid you'd expect to see headlining music festivals someday. And little Emmy? She was the sunshine of the family, a light-hearted, giggling tornado of energy, whose presence made the world feel a little bigger and brighter. Their life was a montage of everyday joys and picture-perfect moments, Mary lovingly arranging Sunday breakfast with pancakes in the shape of animals, Brad teaching Alex how to swing a tennis racket, and family movie nights where they all piled onto the living room couch with popcorn bowls balanced precariously on their laps. They attended church every Sunday, volunteered for community events, and sent out Christmas cards that could have easily been mistaken for professional photo shoots. If there was a single family in the neighborhood to aspire to, the Scotts were it. But beneath that sheen of perfection, there were subtle signs, unspoken tensions, fleeting moments of guarded glances, and little cracks in their pristine foundation that were beginning to form. Most people would have missed these telltale signs entirely, blinded by the surface-level brilliance of the Scotts' portrayal. Neighbors would gush, "What a beautiful family," without ever wondering what might truly lie behind the drawn curtains of their home. This illusion of a perfect life wasn't just about maintaining appearances, it became an integral part of their identity, their safety net, and their shield against the prying eyes of the world. But illusions can only hold up for so long, and as time would soon reveal, the perfect image that Brad and Mary had so carefully cultivated was fragile. It was built on secrets, not the kind whispered playfully across pillowcases, but the kind that festered in the dark. The changing behavior of Brad. It all began subtly, almost unnoticeably, in the early months of 2015. Brad Scott, the once steady and reliable family man, started making small but peculiar changes to his daily routine. At first they were minor, working late more often, mentioning back-to-back surgeries or unexpected emergencies at the hospital. For Mary, it didn't seem too far out of the ordinary. Brad was a cardiologist after all. Unpredictable hours were part of the job, but there was something about the way he explained himself, rushed, as though he didn't want her to ask further questions. Then came the fitness obsession. Brad, who had always casually enjoyed the occasional jog or a game of weekend tennis, suddenly turned into someone Mary barely recognized. He joined a luxury fitness center downtown, cutting deeply into their evenings together with intense workout sessions. He began tightly monitoring his diet, cutting carbs, eating protein shakes, and talking incessantly about his running goals and fitness metrics. The change was drastic, almost as if he was chasing a version of himself that he couldn't quite reach. Mary suspected this newfound fervor for health wasn't merely a hobby, it felt like a distraction, a cover for something she couldn't yet name. Over time, Brad's appearance changed too. Once comfortably carrying a slight softness around his edges, a marker of middle age and long hours at the hospital, he quickly started shedding pounds. It wasn't just weight loss, it was transformation. His tailored suits now hung a little looser on his frame, though Mary noticed he didn't mind. On the contrary, Brad relished the compliments that began rolling in. "Looking sharp, Dr. Scott," a nurse had exclaimed in passing during a hospital fundraiser, which Mary overheard on a rare evening out together. Brad had smiled charmingly, too charmingly in response. And then there were the phone calls. Brad's phone, which used to sit forgotten on the countertop during family dinners, was now always by his side. His ringtone, once a predictable beep, was suddenly silenced, as if set to vibrate at all times. Mary occasionally noticed him stepping onto the back patio, speaking in low tones as he paced. Hospital business, he explained, but the way his voice dropped an octave and his eyes flickered toward the house's windows fed a nagging doubt in Mary's mind. Even more unsettling was the growing distance. The Brad who once called her darling and squeezed her hand while cooking together or watching the evening news felt miles away, even when sitting right next to her. He'd grown quieter, not the comfortable kind of quiet that comes with years of marriage, but the tense, fractured silence of someone holding on to things too tightly. Their once intimate conversations about kids, work, or even mundane gossip were now replaced by a few short exchanges about appointments, schedules, and daily logistics. Mary found herself reminiscing about their earlier days, about the man she fell in love with. Was he really gone, or was she overthinking? The tension between them came into sharper focus one Sunday morning when Mary was folding laundry and noticed a faint whiff of perfume. Honestly, it could have come from anywhere: a patient, a nurse, even a lingering scent from a stranger in an elevator. But this was a smell Mary didn't recognize, and it wasn't hers. That evening, as Brad settled into bed with an air of detachment, she casually asked, "Do hospitals smell like jasmine these days?" Brad froze for just a split second, long enough that Mary noticed. He played it off with a laugh. "Probably some new air freshener in the lounge." Mary nodded, though her stomach churned. As the months went on, Brad's actions grew more baffling. He replaced his entire wardrobe, opting for slim-fitting clothes that seemed more befitting a man half his age. He spent weekends away at medical conferences that Mary never saw on the calendar. On one particular Thursday evening he came home unusually late and smelled faintly of cologne. Not his usual understated brand, but something sharper, muskier, entirely unfamiliar. Mary asked where he'd been, her voice light but her grip on the countertop firm. "Dinner with Dr. Klein. We were talking about funding for a new research program," he'd responded. The explanation was smooth, flowing with the confidence of a man who believed his words could never be questioned. But the moment he turned to leave the kitchen, Mary noticed his hands trembling. It wasn't long before their two daughters, Lisa and Alex, began noticing the shift as well. "Dad seems distant," Lisa mentioned during a family dinner. "No, he doesn't," Brad quickly interjected, forcing a smile. "I'm just busier than usual with work." Alex, always the quiet observer, simply watched as his father changed the subject. Emmy, the youngest, still too innocent to recognize the change, remained blissfully unaware, happy to bask in her father's sporadic attention. By midsummer, Mary couldn't shake the feeling that the man she'd built her life with for nearly 3 decades was slipping away. She hated how her thoughts spiraled, hated doubting Brad, hated the questions she was too afraid to ask outright. But the harder she tried to ignore the signs, the louder they seemed to grow. Something was wrong, something bigger than she could yet comprehend, and her once perfect life was beginning to feel like the prelude to a storm. Sometimes the most significant changes happen quietly, over time. In Brad's case, those changes were deceptive, calculated, and deliberate. It wouldn't be long before the underlying reason for his transformation became impossible to ignore. For Mary, it was only the beginning of uncovering a reality she wasn't prepared to face. Mary discovers the unusual. It was a rainy Thursday afternoon when Mary stumbled upon the first undeniable crack in her picture-perfect life. She had always kept a meticulous home, a habit she had carried since childhood, where tidiness was a virtue her mother instilled deeply in her. The snow-white counters of her kitchen gleamed from her recent cleaning spree, and the scent of pine-scented disinfectant lingered in the air. Organizing the stack of papers Brad tended to leave scattered across the coffee table was not unusual for her. Letter after letter, bills, hospital forms, it was routine. But as she sifted through the familiar, her hand froze when she found something that didn't belong. A crumpled hotel receipt. It was subtle at first glance, the logo of a modest but chic boutique hotel in Portland, a city 2 hours from home. Riverside Suites, it read. Printed beneath the date, April 14, 2015, was a payment record for Dr. Brad Scott, 1 king suite, 2 guests. Mary blinked at it for a while, a heavy weight settling over her chest. 2 guests. Her initial thought was pragmatic. Maybe this was a booking for one of the doctors Brad mentored for a medical conference. But, as her mind churned, fueled by late-night suspicions that had gnawed at her for weeks, unease escalated into something sharper. Why hadn't he mentioned this trip? And why a king suite meant for couples, not colleagues? She reached for her phone out of reflex, thoughts racing. Should she confront him? No, she couldn't, not now. Carefully she slipped the receipt into her pocket, her heart thudding as though she'd just committed a crime. Even with this unsettling find, Mary wanted to convince herself that there was a logical explanation. Brad had always traveled for work, healthcare conferences, charity events. Those were just standard parts of his busy career. But as Mary sat at the kitchen table later that evening, seeing her husband waltz through the door smelling faintly of cologne that she didn't recognize, her stomach churned with suspicion. "Long day?" she asked tentatively as he kissed her cheek, a gesture that now felt rehearsed. "Oh, you have no idea," Brad replied, running a hand through his perfectly coiffed hair. He lowered his briefcase onto the counter, his movements deliberate as though he divided the day into neatly sectioned compartments: work, gym, and home. Mary wanted to mention the receipt right then and there, to wave it in his face and demand the truth. But something stopped her, the deft ease with which Brad masked his emotions. He could always deflect so casually with that magnetic charm of his that had captured her heart 3 decades ago. Tonight was no different. Instead, she opted for an indirect approach, her voice deceptively light. "You haven't mentioned any out-of-town trips lately. Been heading to Portland recently?" Brad froze for barely a second before responding, but even that fraction of hesitation felt like a shout to Mary. No trips, not for months actually. Why?" His tone was nonchalant, but his eyes never quite met hers. They drifted instead to his phone, face down on the kitchen counter. "Just curious," Mary replied quietly. Later that night, alone in bed while Brad showered, Mary opened her bedside drawer and retrieved the hidden receipt she had folded neatly in half. She stared at it under the dim lamplight, her emotions running wild. Was she overthinking? Was this the paranoia of a restless housewife trying to fill in fictional blanks? Or was her intuition sharpening to something undeniable? Days passed, but the unanswered questions hung in the air between them like the scent of stale rain. Then came another moment. A voicemail was accidentally left on her phone from Brad, a brief conversation with an unfamiliar voice. Most of the words were too muffled to make out, but one sentence echoed distinctly. "I had such a wonderful time last week, I can't wait to see you again." Every muscle in Mary's body seemed to freeze as she replayed it over and over. Who was this voice? It wasn't a patient, it wasn't a nurse, and it certainly wasn't anyone whose existence she had known about before. And then came the perfume. One afternoon, while folding laundry, Mary caught a strange and unfamiliar scent clinging to the collar of Brad's dress shirt, a soft floral undertone, subtle but almost mocking in its sweetness. It wasn't her perfume, it wasn't Emmy's or Lisa's either, and it couldn't have been his cologne. She wanted to dismiss it as paranoia again, but every part of her told her otherwise. As she placed the shirt back into the laundry basket, pulling at loose tread near the buttons, her stomach twisted. Soon everything seemed to compound. The late nights at the hospital, the sudden obsession with fitness, the fiercely private use of his phone. Mary felt as though she were living with a stranger, a polite, careful stranger. The breaking point came the weekend before Memorial Day, when Brad came home after a claimed hospital dinner, looking distinctly disheveled. His tie was loose, his shirt wasn't properly buttoned, and Mary swore she saw lipstick smudged faintly on the inside of his collar. She confronted him then, her voice trembling but firm. "Brad, what's going on? Is there someone else?" His reaction was swift and confident, almost as if rehearsed. Brad gave her an exasperated laugh, shaking his head. "Mary, you're being ridiculous. Do you have any idea how much stress I'm under at work? The last thing I'd do is some affair." And yet, underneath his calm exterior, Mary noticed the flicker of something else in his eyes. Guilt? Panic? She couldn't quite name it. But it planted itself deep within her mind, taking root like a growing weed. That night Mary lay in the dark, staring at the ceiling, feeling more alone than ever. Memories of their wedding day flashed in her mind, the way he'd looked at her then, the vows they'd exchanged. She had believed in him with everything she had, but now, doubt was like a cold hand wrapped around her throat, refusing to let go. Something was wrong, deeply and irrevocably wrong. And Mary realized, to her heartbreak, that the man she had loved for nearly 30 years might be hiding something far more sinister than she was ready to uncover. The psychological pressure leading to depression. By mid-2015, Mary Scott found herself drifting to a place she once believed was impossible. Her days, which were once a comforting rhythm of routines, gardening in the morning, catching up with the neighbors, preparing meals for the family, now felt increasingly suffocating. The once warm and lively Scott household, where laughter used to echo in the evenings, now seemed colder, quieter, heavy with an unspoken tension that no amount of sunlight streaming into the immaculate kitchen could brighten. Mary didn't know exactly when the numbness began, but it had crept in slowly, like a fog rolling in off the coast in the early hours of the morning. What started as sleepless nights, staring at the ceiling while Brad snored softly beside her, grew into full days of restlessness and mental exhaustion. The lingering doubts about Brad, his absences, the strange perfume, and that hotel receipt swirled constantly in her mind, eroding her peace like waves breaking against rocky shores. At first, Mary tried to push through and convince herself this was a phase. Everyone had rough patches in marriage, didn't they? She told herself Brad's recent coldness and distance were due to stress from work, that the late nights and his obsessive fitness routine were distractions for a man approaching his 50s, grappling with the realities of aging. She tried to stick to her routines, hoping they would anchor her. She baked cookies for the PTA meetings, attended Emmy's chorus recitals, and volunteered at the church bake sale. Outwardly, Mary was still the picture of the perfect suburban wife, but inside, it felt as though she were crumbling under the weight of uncertainty. Despite her efforts, the cracks began to show. Mary found herself forgetting small details. Did she put Alex's art supplies in his room or leave them in the car? Had she emailed the invitation list for the neighborhood barbecue? Routine tasks that once came naturally now felt cumbersome, and her thoughts seemed perpetually clouded. Brad noticed her detachment, but his reaction was more dismissive than concerned. "You're just overthinking everything," he said one night as Mary tried to broach the topic of her struggles over dinner. "You need to relax, Mary. You worry too much about things that don't matter." But they did matter, at least to Mary. And worse, the emotional distance between them only deepened. Brad, instead of sitting next to her on the couch after dinner, retreated to his study or left for one of his late-night gym sessions. Her attempts to reach out were often met with irritation or brushed off with vague reassurances. "You need to trust me," Brad would say, his voice steady and firm, and every time he looked into her eyes, Mary wanted to believe him. But her instincts whispered otherwise. Gradually, the isolation and the constant mental tug-of-war took a toll on Mary's health. Sleep became elusive. She would lie awake for hours, replaying moments, questioning every interaction and every word spoken. During the day, she often felt dizzy, her body heavy, her limbs weak. Foods she once relished no longer piqued her appetite, and the thought of going out to garden, which once fed her spirit, now filled her with dread. Her children began to notice. Lisa, during one of her rare visits home from medical school, commented on how pale and thin her mother had become. "Mom, are you eating enough? You look like you haven't slept in days," Lisa said one evening, placing a hand on Mary's shoulder. Alex, too, picked up on her silences and distracted gaze. Emmy would occasionally ask, "Mommy, why do you look sad?" out of the innocent curiosity of a child. Every question felt like a knife in Mary's heart, but she couldn't share the chaos inside her. She wasn't even sure where to begin. Feeling like she had nowhere to turn, Mary did what many people in her position might do. She pretended. She went through the motions, forcing smiles when she felt hollow inside. On the outside, she kept up the veneer of normalcy, waving politely to neighbors, packing lunches for Emmy, and asking Brad how his day went, but pretending only added to her exhaustion. It wasn't long before the cracks in Mary's own personal facade started to show even more. One day she broke down crying in the car after running errands, her hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly her knuckles turned white. Alone in a parking lot, she wiped away tears with trembling hands, terrified that someone she knew might walk by and see her unraveling. Brad, surprisingly, paid just enough attention to notice that Mary wasn't herself, but instead of offering solace, he proposed what he thought was a solution. "You're just stressed, Mary," he said one evening as they sat across from each other at the dinner table, the clinking of silverware the only sound in the room. "Maybe what you need is a change, freshen things up. You're still beautiful, but maybe you'd feel better if, you did something for yourself." Mary looked up at him confused. "What do you mean, do something for myself?" Brad leaned back in his chair, choosing his words carefully. "I've read that a lot of women your age feel rejuvenated after a little self-care. Maybe, a small cosmetic procedure. It's not uncommon these days, and we can afford the best care. It might help you feel a little more confident again." He smiled faintly as though he had just provided the perfect solution. Mary felt as though the air had been knocked out of her. Was this how Brad saw her now? Worn down, aged, and in need of physical fixing? But instead of voicing her hurt, Mary nodded meekly. At that moment, she didn't have the energy to argue. If Brad thought this would help, maybe he was right. In the weeks that followed, Brad seemed unusually insistent about the idea. He made calls, arranged appointments, even brought home brochures from well-regarded clinics specializing in cosmetic surgery. Mary felt like a passenger in the process, her voice small and uncertain while Brad's was calm and authoritative. And despite the nagging feeling in the back of her mind that this wasn't the solution she truly needed, Mary clung to the faint hope that maybe, just maybe, it would fix something. For herself, for her marriage, for her family. But deep inside, she feared that no surgery or procedure could repair the fractures running through her life. It was this mix of doubt, exhaustion, and fragile hope that ultimately led Mary to agree to a decision that would change her family forever. A decision Brad had orchestrated, perhaps not for the reasons she initially believed. A death shrouded in suspicion. The snow outside the Scott family house, freshly fallen from the night before, remained untouched on the morning of December 17th. The holidays were just around the corner, and the quiet suburb was rich with the sounds of carolers practicing their songs and neighbors stringing up Christmas lights. For everyone in the community, it seemed like the season of joy and celebration was in full swing. But for the Scott household, that day was destined to become the stage of a tragedy that no one could have predicted or ignored. The 911 call came from Brad's cell phone just past 9 a.m. His voice, familiar to anyone who had seen him deliver calm, authoritative instructions as a physician, was strangely uneven, almost frantic. I need help," he shouted through the line. "My wife, she's in the bathtub. She won't wake up." Emergency responders arrived within minutes, the flashing red and blue lights reflecting off the Scott family windows. Brad met them at the door, his usually composed demeanor replaced with an unnerving mix of panic and confusion. "I found her there," he explained, pointing toward the bathroom at the end of the hall. I was downstairs making coffee, and then I went to check on her. She was taking a bath, but she didn't respond." His words tumbled out quick and scattered, and he ran his hands through his already disheveled hair. For a man known for his poise in the middle of emergencies, his manner struck the paramedics as oddly fragile. As the responders worked, Brad stood off to the side, pacing back and forth. Occasionally he darted anxious glances toward the bathroom as if willing them to save her. But after 15 minutes, they emerged with grim faces. Mary Scott, 52 years old, was pronounced dead at the scene. The official assumption was straightforward at first, an accidental drowning. After all, Mary had recently undergone cosmetic surgery at Brad's encouragement and was rumored to still be recovering. Could she have fainted in the bathtub, slipped? The possibilities seemed endless, yet plausible enough. But as detectives arrived at the scene to draft their report, small, unsettling details began to emerge. The first thing that caught their attention was the water level in the bathtub. It was suspiciously low, barely high enough to cover someone's waist, let alone create the conditions for drowning. If Mary had truly lost consciousness in that tub, how could she have drowned in such shallow water? Then, there were the bruises. Subtle but visible, they dotted Mary's wrists and upper arms. The paramedics initially brushed them off as incidental. Perhaps she slipped and fell before landing awkwardly in the tub. But when viewed in the context of the other irregularities, the bruises began to raise more troubling questions. Brad's version of events, while outwardly clear, began to feel rehearsed. He described Mary waking up early that morning and deciding she wanted a long bath to relieve her aching muscles. "She complained about feeling lightheaded lately," he added, almost as an afterthought, his voice cracking. "I even told her this morning, 'Don't overdo it, Mary.' I said those words." Despite the seeming authenticity of his sorrow, something didn't sit right with the officers processing the scene. As the medical examiner prepared to take Mary's body for further analysis, one detective, Detective Harper, lingered near Brad, watching him closely. Harper had been on the force for over 20 years, and through countless cases he had become adept at reading people. There was something about Brad, a tension in his movements, the way he avoided looking anyone directly in the eyes, that felt calculated. When asked to clarify the timeline of events that morning, Brad gave a polite but vague response. "I went to make coffee," he said, nodding toward the still steaming cup on the kitchen counter. "She said she wanted some quiet time in the bath. I didn't think anything of it until she didn't answer me calling her name." He let out a shuddering sigh, pressing his palms against his forehead as if overwhelmed by his own recollection. But Harper noted Brad's hands weren't trembling, nor did his voice crack in the way most grieving spouses' voices do. It was almost as if Brad's grief was perfectly controlled, like a performance just convincing enough to keep suspicion at bay. Meanwhile, the Scott children, who had all been informed of their mother's sudden passing, rushed home to be with their father. Lisa, in particular, arrived visibly shaken, her voice trembling as she demanded to see the coroner's report the moment it was available. "This doesn't make sense," she whispered to Alex in the corner of the living room, away from Brad's line of sight. She was healthy. She would never lose her balance like that." Alex nodded silently, his face pale with disbelief, while Emmy clung tearfully to his side. By the time the family gathered for Mary's funeral the following week, whispers had already begun circulating among the community. Some neighbors speculated privately that Mary's death was simply a tragic accident that had come at the worst possible time, just as the holidays were nearing. Others, however, exchanged quiet remarks as they noticed something off about Brad's demeanor. At the vigil, Brad's tears were sparse. His handshake with the pastor was firm and deliberate, not the faltering, clammy grip of a devastated widower. Several guests mentioned how put together he seemed compared to his sobbing children. And then there were the rumors, the quiet murmurs among friends, pieced together from scattered observations over the last few months. People began recounting the subtle but unexplained shifts in Brad's behavior prior to Mary's death. His nights away from home, the obsessive gym habit that consumed his evenings, and the whispered conversations he seemed to have whenever he thought no one was listening. "He's grieving in his own way," some said defensively, but others weren't so sure. As the autopsy results began trickling in, those doubts started to solidify. While Mary's official cause of death was listed as drowning, traces of an unknown sedative were found in her system, enough to cause dizziness or even unconsciousness but not enough to kill her outright. Additionally, when toxicology reports revealed the substance was a medication she had never been prescribed, investigators began to take a closer look at Brad Scott, his conduct, his accounts of the morning, and the financial records that would soon reveal secrets Mary may have never imagined. Suddenly, Mary's death was no longer just an accident. It was the starting point of a mystery far darker than anyone in the Scott family, or their seemingly idyllic town, was prepared to face. Doubts from the children. In the weeks following Mary's untimely death, the Scott family struggled to pick up the pieces. The once lively home now felt suffocatingly quiet, its warmth replaced by a chilling emptiness. The kids, each in their own way, tried to process the tragedy, but the questions weighing on their hearts refused to fade. For Lisa, Alex, and Emmy, their mother's death was more than a sudden, heartbreaking loss. It was a puzzle with missing pieces, and no matter how much they tried to ignore the unease creeping into their thoughts, it grew louder with time. Lisa, as the eldest and the most meticulous of the siblings, was the first to voice her suspicions. A medical student just months away from beginning her residency, Lisa had been trained to analyze details and trust her instincts. During her last visit home before her mother's death, Lisa had noticed something odd. Mary, typically vibrant and organized, had been unusually lethargic, complaining of dizziness and fatigue. When pressed, Mary hesitated to give a clear answer, and only mentioned that Brad had encouraged her to take some supplements and anti-anxiety medication to help manage her recovery after the cosmetic surgery. Sitting alone at the kitchen table late one evening, Lisa replayed these moments in her mind, accompanied by disturbing recollections of her father's behavior. "Dad seemed overbearing," she muttered to herself, her fingers tapping anxiously on the wooden surface. She hadn't thought much of it at the time. After all, Brad was a doctor, and he'd always been meticulous about the family's health. But now that same attentiveness felt strange, almost calculated. Why had her father insisted on Mary taking those medications? Why hadn't he asked Mary's surgeon to prescribe them instead? And why had Mary seemed so hesitant to talk about it whenever Lisa asked? One evening, as Lisa searched the house for documents related to the funeral arrangements, she stumbled upon a prescription bottle on her father's desk. The name on the label wasn't her mother's. It wasn't even prescribed to anyone in their family. Upon carefully examining its contents, Lisa discovered it was a heavy sedative. Her stomach churned. What was this doing here? Why would her father have something like this in his possession, especially when it wasn't prescribed to anyone under his care? Lisa's unease grew with each passing day. She couldn't ignore the strange details surrounding her mother's death. The more she thought about it, the more doubts began to pile up like a dark cloud. She couldn't shake the feeling that her mother's death wasn't just a tragic accident, it was unnatural, something orchestrated. She confided these fears to Alex one afternoon, catching him in the garage as he repaired one of Mary's old art displays that had fallen apart after the funeral. Alex, always the quiet and introspective sibling, had been handling his grief by diving into his art. "Alex," Lisa started, her voice low but slightly trembling, "I need to talk to you about Mom, about how she—" She trailed off, searching for the right words. Alex looked up from his paint-streaked hands, his expression unreadable. "What is it?" he asked warily. Lisa hesitated, then sat down beside him, clutching the mysterious prescription bottle she'd found earlier. "I don't think this was an accident," she said softly, the words hanging heavy in the air. "There are too many things that don't add up. Mom never told me about these sedatives, but Dad had them, just sitting in his office. Do you remember how tired she was? How she could barely get out of bed sometimes?" Alex furrowed his brow in confusion, then sighed heavily. "I noticed it too, Liz," he admitted. "I thought it was the surgery or stress, but now that you say it, she didn't seem like herself, not for months." He shook his head and stared at the floor. "What are you trying to say, though? That Dad—" His voice trailed off, unable to speak the thought aloud. Lisa nodded, though tears glistened in her eyes. "I don't want to believe it either, Alex, but something isn't right, and I think we need to figure out what it is." As the weeks unfolded, Alex began paying closer attention and sifting through his own hazy memories. He recalled heated arguments between his parents that he had dismissed as routine disagreements, Brad's sharp, almost dismissive tone, Mary's timid apologies that never felt genuine. He also remembered the strange night before her death when Brad had left the dinner table suddenly after receiving a phone call. When Mary had asked what was wrong, Brad had curtly replied, "Nothing that concerns you," and stormed off to his office. Even Emmy, at just 10 years old, had begun expressing confusion. One afternoon, as Lisa helped her with a homework project, Emmy suddenly said, "I don't think Mom liked whatever tea Dad gave her." Lisa froze, setting down the pencil she was using. "What do you mean, Emmy?" she asked gently, trying to mask the anxiety that began bubbling inside her chest. Emmy shrugged, her innocence apparent in every word. "Daddy used to bring her tea every night, but I heard her tell Aunt Rachel that it made her feel funny. She said it made her too sleepy, even in the mornings." Lisa's heart dropped. Whatever had been in those cups of tea could have been laced with the sedatives Brad had in his office. Emmy's innocent observation, though incomplete, was another thread in the unraveling mystery. As the three siblings began piecing together their memories and suspicions, tensions in the Scott house grew heavier. Brad, ever the charismatic father and figure of authority, moved through the house seemingly oblivious to their quiet investigations. He continued his routine as if nothing had happened, the gym sessions, the late nights spent working, and the overly casual demeanor that now felt more suspicious than comforting. "I think we need to tell the police," Lisa finally declared one night, her voice trembling but resolute as she sat across from Alex at the dining room table. The house was quiet, with only the sound of Emmy's faint giggles from the living room as she watched a cartoon. Alex leaned back in his chair, rubbing his temples. "You know what this could do, don't you?" he whispered harshly, glancing toward their father's study to ensure they weren't overheard. "If we're wrong, Liz, this could destroy him. Destroy our family." Lisa's jaw tightened. "What if we're right, Alex? What if he's responsible for what happened to Mom? I don't know about you, but I need to know the truth, and if Dad has nothing to hide, then there's nothing to worry about." Alex sighed deeply, but eventually nodded. "Fine, but you're taking the lead on this. The police aren't going to listen to me, but you? You're the perfect child, the med student. They'll listen to you." With Alex reluctantly on board, Lisa knew there was no turning back. She would expose the truth, no matter what it revealed about the man she had once idolized. If their father was hiding something, she owed it to their mother, and to the family Mary had loved so fiercely, to uncover it. The investigation uncovers the truth. As Lisa and Alex wrestled with their suspicions, the police were already deep into their investigation. Mary's death, initially ruled as an accidental drowning, had begun raising serious questions among investigators. The low water level in the bathtub, the bruises on Mary's wrists, and the traces of an unknown sedative found in her system, none of it added up to a simple accident. But the breakthrough came when Lisa decided to reach out to Detective Harper, the lead investigator on the case. She didn't call him for weeks, afraid of the implications of her suspicions about Brad. Yet, one sleepless night after finding Emmy's comments about the tea replaying in her mind, she grabbed her phone in the dark and dialed his number. "Detective Harper, this is Lisa Scott, Mary Scott's daughter," she said softly. her voice trembling but firm. Harper immediately recognized the name. "Yes, Lisa." His voice was calm, patient. "What can I do for you?" There was a long pause on Lisa's end of the line. Finally she took a deep breath and said the words she'd been terrified to voice. I think my father might be involved in what happened to my mom. I know how it sounds," she added quickly, guilt pressing against her like a heavy weight. "But there are things I can't ignore. I think you need to take a closer look at him." Harper, to his credit, didn't sound shocked. He'd been a detective for over 2 decades and had seen families unravel in unimaginable ways. "Okay, Lisa," he said gently, "why don't you tell me everything?" Over the course of the next hour, Lisa poured out all her doubts and observations. She told Harper about the prescription bottle she found in Brad's office, the unexplained fatigue her mother had suffered in the months leading up to her death, and Emmy's innocent comment about the tea that made Mary feel too sleepy. She also described how Brad had become increasingly distant in the years prior, his sudden obsession with fitness, and the countless medical conferences that conveniently kept him out of town. When she finally stopped talking, the line was silent for a moment, then Harper said, "You did the right thing calling me. I'll look into everything, but Lisa, this isn't something you'll want to keep to yourself. You need to tell your siblings what's going on, and you need to be ready for what we may uncover." By the next day, Harper and his team began digging deeper into Brad's financial records, phone activity, and work history. What they uncovered painted a picture of a man far different from the charming community figure and respected doctor everyone thought they knew. For starters, there were the frequent out-of-town trips Brad claimed were for medical conferences. Hotel and travel records showed a pattern of visits to boutique hotels, often in nearby cities like Portland and San Francisco, none of which were tied to any professional or medical events. Worse, in many of these bookings, Brad had reserved suites for 2 guests. Then there was the discovery of large unexplained purchases. Over the course of several years, Brad had been withdrawing significant sums of money investigators believed had been funneled toward maintaining an extramarital relationship. Jewelry receipts, lavish dinners, and even a lease for an apartment downtown in Seattle all pointed to the existence of another woman. The team also found discrepancies in Brad's medical records, particularly his role in prescribing medication. While doctors are allowed to prescribe certain medications for personal or family use, there was an alarming pattern in how Brad had requested controlled substances in small, consistent amounts. The sedative found in Mary's system matched a substance Brad had ordered 6 months prior, ostensibly for a colleague's research project, a justification investigators were quick to see through. As the evidence began to pile up, Harper decided it was time to bring Lisa and Alex in for a meeting at the station. The siblings sat across from Harper in a stark gray interrogation room, their faces pale and tense. Lisa held a notebook, her fingers gripping it tightly, while Alex sat silently, his jaw clenched. "There's no easy way to say this," Harper began, folding his hands on the table in front of him. "But I believe you're right. Your father isn't being truthful about what happened to your mom." Lisa swallowed hard, nodding. "What have you found?" Harper leaned in slightly, his voice low and steady. "We have reason to believe Brad was involved in a long-term affair with another woman. We've found evidence of a second residence he maintained downtown, as well as financial records suggesting he's been supporting someone outside of your family for years." Alex inhaled sharply, leaning back in his chair. "Jesus," he muttered under his breath. Lisa, though shocked, motioned for Harper to continue. "We've also confirmed that the sedative found in your mother's system was something Brad had access to. The dosage alone was high enough to cause dizziness, confusion, or even unconsciousness. Combined with the physical evidence, the bruises on her arms, the inconsistencies in his story, it's clear we're looking at something intentional, not accidental." Lisa's eyes filled with tears, though she refused to let them fall. She tightened her grip on her notebook and asked in a soft, trembling voice, "Do you think he killed her?" Harper exhaled deeply. "We still need more evidence, Lisa, but I can tell you this, it's hard to ignore the signs." The siblings left the station that day with their heads spinning. Alex remained uncharacteristically quiet as they drove home, his knuckles white as he gripped the steering wheel. Lisa, seated in the passenger seat, stared out the window in silence, her thoughts racing. Neither of them wanted to believe their father could be capable of such a thing, but the evidence left little room for doubt. When they arrived home, Emmy met them at the door, clutching one of Mary's old scarves. "Did you find out anything about Mom?" she asked, her small voice trembling. Lisa knelt down, placing a hand gently on her little sister's shoulder. "Not yet, Emmy," she said softly, "but we're going to find the truth, I promise." Inside the house, Brad sat in the living room sipping a glass of wine as if nothing had changed. He glanced up at his kids as they entered but said nothing, his expression unreadable. Lisa exchanged a tense look with Alex. They both knew the man sitting before them wasn't who he claimed to be. The investigation hadn't just uncovered secrets about Mary's death, it had shattered the image of the father they thought they knew, and now, as they looked at him, they wondered just how many lies he had been hiding all along. The evidence and the trial. The trial of Dr. Brad Scott, once a pillar of respect in the suburban community, became a spectacle that captivated not only the town but the entire nation. Newspapers heralded it as the fall of the perfect family man, and talk shows buzzed with headlines dissecting every new revelation. The family that once symbolized trust and harmony was now irreparably divided, its fractures laid bare for all to see. But before the courtroom drama began, it was the mountain of evidence against Brad that painted a devastatingly clear picture of betrayal and murder. The smoking gun. The case began to snowball when Detective Harper and his team secured a search warrant for Brad's office and personal belongings. What they uncovered made the once waffling narrative sharp and undeniable. Forensic teams recovered a notebook from Brad's locked desk drawer containing meticulous, almost obsessive entries. It wasn't a personal journal, as one might expect, but rather an informal ledger with doses of medications and scribbled notes. Among the entries were alarming annotations regarding sedative dosages. Mary's name wasn't explicitly mentioned, but the handwriting, the dates, and the chilling detail all but pointed to her as the victim. Even more damning was the bottle of sedative found during the original investigation. Its serial number connected directly to Brad's recent prescription logs. The sedative matched the compound found in Mary's autopsy, leaving no room for coincidence. But the true smoking gun came from a forensic analysis of Brad's laptop. Investigators discovered hundreds of emails exchanged between Brad and a woman named Samantha Holt, a name that would later become infamous as Brad's mistress. Many of these messages detailed intimate plans, including exactly how Brad was going to leave his wife and move forward with Samantha. One particular email sent just 3 weeks before Mary's death chilled investigators and prosecutors alike. "Once I have everything in order, her condition will take care of the rest. It'll look accidental, just like we discussed. Be patient, Sam, it's almost over." The discovery of this digital correspondence became the cornerstone of the prosecution's case. It wasn't just premeditation, it was a roadmap to murder. The courtroom drama. By late 2015, the Scott family found themselves at the center of one of the most highly publicized trials the county had ever seen. Every day, reporters crowded the courthouse parking lot, cameras snapping as Brad exited a sleek black car, flanked by a team of high-profile defense attorneys. Yet no amount of legal polish could mask the sense of tension radiating from him. Lisa and Alex, meanwhile, sat on the other side of the courtroom, always present, always silent, their faces taut with a mixture of grief and resolve. Emmy was kept away from the proceedings, shielded by relatives who felt she was too young to endure such a heart-wrenching exposure. From the opening statements, the prosecution painted a devastating picture of Brad's double life. They began with the financial records, highlighting thousands of dollars spent on Samantha Holt, the dinners, the jewelry, the downtown apartment. "This wasn't a man who intended to work things out with his wife," the prosecutor said. "This was a man with a motive, a clear plan, and the means to execute it." The attorney stepped closer to the jury, holding up an enlarged image of Brad's email to Samantha. "It'll look accidental, just like we discussed." He let the words hang in the air, heavy and cold. The defense, however, was just as determined to prove Brad's innocence. His attorney, a sharp-dressed man with years of high-profile cases behind him, argued that the evidence was circumstantial at best. "There's no direct proof that Dr. Scott caused his wife's death," he said, pacing before the jury. "We're talking about emails without context, fragmented notes that could mean anything, and sedatives that, let's not forget, Mary herself could have taken willingly or accidentally. They even tried to paint Brad as a grieving husband whose affair, while a mistake, didn't make him a murderer." "Infidelity is not a crime," the defense attorney stated. "It's a moral failing, yes, but it doesn't mean Brad Scott intended to harm his wife." Lisa takes the stand. The turning point in the trial came when Lisa was called to the stand. In the weeks leading up to the trial, she debated whether or not to testify. Speaking out against her own father felt unthinkable, but she knew she owed it to her mother to tell the truth. As she sat before the silent courtroom, the prosecutor began gently. "Lisa, can you describe the changes you noticed in your mother's behavior leading up to her death?" Lisa nodded slowly, her voice trembling slightly as she began to speak. "She was tired all the time, more than usual. She'd tell me she felt dizzy, like she couldn't stay awake. At first I thought it was the stress of recovery, but after a while, it didn't add up." The prosecutor handed Lisa a printed email, the same one that contained Brad's chilling promise to Samantha. "Have you seen this before?" Lisa swallowed hard and nodded. "Yes. Do you believe your father was capable of carrying out what's described here?" For a moment, Lisa's resolve wavered. Tears glistened in her eyes as she looked at the man who had once been her hero. "I didn't want to believe it," she admitted, her voice breaking. "But he was the only one who could have done this. He controlled everything, what she ate, what medicines she took. He told her to trust him, and she did, but he betrayed her." The courtroom fell silent, save for the sound of Brad shifting uncomfortably in his seat. The verdict. After weeks of testimony, cross-examination, and painstaking recreations of the events surrounding Mary's death, the jury deliberated for 2 long days. Finally they returned, faces tense as they filed into their seats. The foreperson stood, addressing the judge. "In the matter of the state versus Dr. Bradley Scott, we find the defendant guilty of first-degree murder." Gasps rippled through the courtroom. Lisa let out a breath she didn't know she'd been holding, gripping Alex's hand as tears streamed down her face. Brad, meanwhile, sat motionless, his expression unreadable as the weight of the verdict settled over him. For once, his polished composure had cracked. The judge sentenced Brad to life in prison, without the possibility of parole, citing the cold and calculated nature of his crime, his affair, his financial deception, and most damningly, his abuse of trust as a husband left no room for mercy. The aftermath. For Lisa, Alex, and Emmy, the verdict was a bittersweet conclusion to a nightmare that had upended their lives. Justice had been served, but it could never bring back their mother. The house that had once been filled with warmth and laughter now felt like a painful reminder of what they had lost. Lisa returned to medical school, channeling her grief into becoming the kind of compassionate physician her mother had always inspired her to be. Alex found solace in his art, pouring his emotions onto canvas in bold, expressive strokes. And Emmy, though young, would grow up carrying the memory of her mother as a source of strength. As the family tried to rebuild, one truth remained clear. Mary Scott's story was not just a cautionary tale about lies and betrayal, it was a testament to the resilience of those left behind. The sentence for Brad. The courtroom was packed the day Brad Scott learned his fate. Spectators lined the benches, and the hushed murmur of anxious anticipation rippled through the room like the quiet roar of an approaching storm. It was the culmination of months of intense investigation, emotional testimony, and a family fractured beyond repair. By the time the judge entered to deliver the sentencing, all eyes were on Brad, once a beloved community figure, now sitting stiffly at the defendant's table, his slicked-back hair and tailored suit nearly failing to mask the cracks in his composed demeanor. For all the confidence Brad exuded at the start of the trial, by the sentencing phase, even he looked noticeably weathered. The trial had been brutal. Every secret, every lie he'd carefully hidden over the years, had been dragged into the light for public consumption. His affair with Samantha Holt, the prescriptions for sedatives, the chilling evidence of premeditation, each detail had stripped away his spotless reputation, layer by layer. Now Brad sat with his hands folded on the table, staring ahead, no longer the stoic doctor but a man visibly burdened by the weight of inevitability. Judge Wilson, a stern yet fair man who was well respected in the legal community, looked down on Brad with an expression that was equal parts pity and contempt. He glanced at the folder in front of him which contained the jury's unanimous verdict, guilty of first-degree murder. As the room fell silent, the judge began to speak. "Dr. Bradley Scott, throughout this trial the evidence presented by the prosecution has made one thing strikingly clear. Mary Scott trusted you. She trusted you not only as her husband of nearly 30 years but as a doctor, a man sworn to care, to protect, to heal. That trust was your weapon, and you wielded it for your own selfish gain." From her seat in the gallery, Lisa felt her throat tighten as she heard these words. She clutched Alex's hand, her grip firm but trembling, while Emmy, too young to fully comprehend the gravity of the moment, sat quietly, staring at the back of her father's head. The judge continued, his tone steady and deliberate. What you did, Dr. Scott, was not an act of passion or a spur-of-the-moment decision. It was cold, calculated, and deliberate. You used the trust of your family, the resources available to you as a medical professional, and most disturbingly, the vulnerabilities of the woman who loved and devoted herself to you, all for your own personal gain. Your actions weren't just a betrayal of Mary Scott as a wife and mother, they were a betrayal of humanity's basic moral principles. Brad showed no visible reaction, but those closest to him, his attorney seated by his side, could see him gripping the edges of his chair. The judge leaned slightly forward, his voice hardening. I have reviewed the evidence in painstaking detail, and for every argument your defense has attempted to make in your favor, there remains one undeniable truth. You planned this. You manipulated Mary's health, knowingly made her take sedatives that weakened her, and when you orchestrated her death, you tried to disguise it as an unfortunate accident. I cannot in good conscience offer leniency for a crime that was so inhumanely premeditated. Lisa felt tears well up in her eyes. She didn't want to cry for Brad, not anymore. These weren't tears of sorrow for the man she once called her hero, but for her mother, for the closure this moment was finally bringing her. The judge then delivered the final words, words that would seal Brad's fate forever. It is the decision of this court that you, Dr. Bradley Scott, be sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. You will spend the rest of your life behind bars in reflection of the life and dignity you so selfishly destroyed. A collective gasp rippled through the courtroom. The reality of the verdict hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. Reporters scribbling frantically in their notebooks leaned closer, eager to capture every moment, every flicker of emotion. Cameras outside the courthouse were no doubt broadcasting live reactions to the breaking news. Dr. Brad Scott, once a respected cardiologist and pillar of the suburban community, was officially sentenced to spend the rest of his life in prison. Brad's reaction. Despite the weight of the sentence, Brad's expression was unreadable. As the courtroom buzzed with murmurs of relief, shock, and even quiet applause, he sat motionless, staring at a spot on the floor as if he hadn't quite processed what had just happened. His attorney leaned in, whispering something that Brad appeared to ignore. But to those who had watched him carefully throughout the trial, Detective Harper, Lisa, Alex, and even the judge, it was obvious that Brad's silence wasn't born out of shock. It was calculation, the very thing that had defined him in the years leading up to this moment. Whether he was truly suppressing grief or simply swallowing the humiliation of defeat, no one could say for sure. The family's reaction. Lisa stepped out of the courtroom first, her shoulders shaking as tears began to fall freely for the first time in weeks. Alex trailed close behind, his lips pressed into a thin line, his hand on her shoulder in a rare moment of comfort for his typically stoic self. Emmy, quiet as ever, clutched her sister's side, listening as Lisa whispered, "It's over, Emmy. It's over now." But was it really? For the Scott children, the sentencing brought closure to some degree, but it also left behind scars that no verdict could heal. The man who had once been their protector, their provider, the foundation upon which their family had once stood, was now a convicted murderer. Alex's mind spiraled with conflicting emotions as he stared at the reporters gathering on the courthouse steps. He hated his father for what he had done, for tearing their family apart and jeopardizing every ounce of security they had ever known. But buried deep beneath the hatred was still a flicker of something else, grief, perhaps not for the man Brad turned out to be, but for the father Alex had once thought he was. Lisa, meanwhile, strengthened her resolve in the wake of the verdict. "He showed no remorse," she whispered to Alex as they prepared to step into the media frenzy waiting outside. "None. Mom deserved better than this." Brad's final words. As he was escorted out of the courtroom in handcuffs, Brad was given one last opportunity to address the court and his family. The room fell silent as everyone turned their gaze toward him. For a moment it seemed as though he might deliver an apology, a shred of regret for the family he destroyed, but Brad simply straightened his back, his voice low and smooth. "I loved Mary in my own way," he stated cryptically, his words sending a chill through the room, "and one day, my kids will understand that." Lisa visibly flinched. Alex's jaw tightened. Emmy, too young to comprehend the implications, stared at her father with wide, unblinking eyes. Aftermath. In the weeks that followed, the Scott children began the slow, painful process of rebuilding their lives. Lisa dove headfirst into medical school, determined to honor her mother by becoming the kind of doctor Mary would have admired. Alex sought refuge in his art, using paint and pencil to release emotions he couldn't yet express. And Emmy, under the care of extended family, clung to her memories of better times, times when the Scott household was whole, even if the perfection they once believed in had been nothing more than an illusion. For the community, the trial served as a sobering reminder that even the most picture-perfect lives can harbor dark secrets. As the news cycle eventually moved on to other scandals, the Scott name faded from the headlines, but for those who had known them personally, the story of Mary's death and Brad's betrayal remained a haunting tale. And for Brad, the once successful doctor now confined to a prison cell, life would become a long, quiet stretch of days filled with nothing but time to reflect, to deflect, and perhaps to live with the truth he tried so hard to bury. Lessons and the family's recovery. In the aftermath of the trial, the Scott family was left grappling with the pieces of their broken lives. For Lisa, Alex, and Emmy, Brad's conviction brought closure in some ways, but it also left behind a haunting void. The fallout of learning that their father, the man who had once been their protector and provider, was capable of such a calculated betrayal cast long shadows over their future. The family home, once the picture of warmth and suburban comfort, stood eerily quiet in the weeks after the sentencing. The laughter that used to echo through the halls, the family dinners, and Emmy's youthful giggles playing on the tire swing had all been replaced by heavy silences. It wasn't just the absence of Mary, it was the knowledge that their idyllic life had been built on lies and manipulation. Brad's betrayal didn't just destroy their trust in him, it disrupted their sense of stability and left each child grappling with difficult questions about identity, family, and how to move forward. Lisa's path of determination. As the eldest, Lisa took it upon herself to hold the family together. She had always been the high achiever, the one Mary trusted with responsibility, and now she felt an overwhelming pressure to step into her mother's shoes. But Lisa wasn't just driven by duty, she was fueled by grief and guilt. In the months following her father's sentencing, Lisa threw herself into her studies at medical school with a ferocious determination. She worked long nights at the hospital during her clerkship, often opting for double shifts, not because she had to, but because it kept her distracted from the gnawing ache of loss. On the rare nights she returned home, she would sit in her childhood bedroom, flipping through old family photo albums. One photo in particular always caught her attention: Mary standing in the garden holding a tray of lemonade with her signature warm smile. It was a simple moment, but it reminded Lisa of her mother's resilience, how Mary always found ways to create beauty even during difficult times. For Lisa, the memory became a source of strength. She would have wanted me to keep going, Lisa often reminded herself, to live a life that honors her. Despite the emotional weight she carried, Lisa was determined to become the kind of doctor her mother would have been proud of, a compassionate healer who prioritized her patients' well-being, driven not by ambition, but by empathy and purpose. Alex finds solace in art. Alex, the quiet, artistic soul of the family, found himself retreating into his paint and sketchbooks in the months after Mary's death. While Lisa sought answers and closure through action, Alex dealt with his grief in solitude, often locking himself in the garage-turned-workshop where Mary used to store her gardening supplies. It was there, surrounded by the faint scent of soil and the tools that Mary meticulously organized, that Alex began creating what would become his most personal and powerful work. His paintings, once abstract and experimental, transformed into vivid emotional tributes to his mother. In one particularly striking piece, Alex depicted Mary surrounded by her garden, her figure glowing with vibrant yellows and greens, symbolizing the life and energy she brought to their home. For Alex, painting wasn't just a form of expression, it was a way to process the unspoken emotions he couldn't articulate. "Art was how I talked to Mom after she was gone," he later admitted to Lisa during one of their rare heart-to-hearts. It became his therapy, offering him a way to reconnect with the better memories of their family while working through his grief and anger at their father. But Alex's work wasn't just personal. Over time it began to resonate with others. When he held his first gallery opening 2 years after Mary's death, it was filled with visitors from the community, neighbors who remembered Mary and wanted to honor her memory through Alex's art. His paintings weren't just a tribute to his mother, they became a symbol of resilience, proof that even in the face of darkness, beauty could emerge. Emmy's innocence and growth. Emmy, the youngest of the Scott children, faced perhaps the toughest road to recovery. Only 10 years old at the time of Mary's death, Emmy had not fully grasped the depths of the tragedy that had unfolded around her. In her young mind, the world was still divided into simple terms. Her mother was gone, and her father wasn't coming home. The why behind it all was a question she wasn't ready to confront yet. For months, Emmy carried Mary's scarf wherever she went, a habit Lisa noticed but didn't discourage. The scarf, faintly scented with Mary's perfume, became Emmy's security blanket, a small piece of her mother she could cling to when the world felt too confusing. It was through Lisa and Alex's quiet support that Emmy began to heal. Lisa often sat with her at night reading Mary's favorite bedtime stories, the same ones Mary used to read aloud. Alex introduced Emmy to painting, giving her blank canvases to fill with her imagination. Soon the home began to feel just a little warmer, with Emmy's childlike sketches decorating the refrigerator once again. As Emmy grew older and began to understand the truth about what happened to her family, her memories of her mother became a guiding light. "Mom was strong," she once told Lisa. "She never gave up, and I don't want to give up either." Lessons from a broken family. For the Scott children, the years that followed were marked not just by grief, but by hard-earned wisdom. Their family's public fall from grace taught them that perfection was an illusion, one that can crumble when held together by deceit. But it also taught them the power of resilience, the ability to rebuild when the world seems determined to knock you down. Each sibling took away a different lesson. For Lisa, it was the importance of integrity, living a life guided by truth and compassion. For Alex, it was the value of channeling pain into creation, turning loss into something meaningful. And for Emmy, it was the enduring strength of love, even in the face of betrayal. But perhaps the most profound lesson came in their unity. Despite everything they had endured, the siblings leaned on each other as they moved forward. They became not just a family but a team, each one supporting the other in ways they never had before. Mary's legacy lives on. Though Mary was gone, her presence lingered in every part of the Scotts' lives. She was in Lisa's bedside manner when she comforted a patient. She was in Alex's bold brushstrokes and vivid colors, and she was in Emmy's quiet confidence as she navigated adolescence, carrying her mother's strength within her. The Scotts had lost much, but they refused to lose themselves. They chose to honor Mary not by dwelling on the tragedy, but by embracing the lessons she had taught them about kindness, resilience, and the beauty of an honest, loving life. In doing so, they found that even amidst loss, hope could bloom again, just as Mary's garden once flourished under her caring hands. And while their family would never be the same, they learned to grow in remembrance of the woman who had always held them together.